I've said it before and I'll say it again. I'm a Crash fan. Crash was one of the big three video game characters that made my childhood, being the game franchise I played the most, with the other two being Kirby, with Kirby's Adventure being the first game I ever played, and Lara Croft, with Tomb Raider being the game me and my dad would play together. Back when he liked video games. And even though Spyro was never a key player in my childhood, he was still there. When I was a kid, I had Spyro 3 on PlayStation 1, but I never completed it 100%. Not for lack of trying, but some of the missions in that game were... just awful. And over time, the Spyro series just kind of fell off my radar. No thanks to lackluster sequels, horrible reboots, and whatever the hell Skylanders was. But now the dragon is back and ready to flame, with 3 remade adventures. What I'm trying to say is that I'm essentially looking at most of Spyro for the first time in this collection, so comparisons to the original will be almost non-existent. So here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to judge the entire Spyro Reignited Trilogy as a single entity. I'm not going to do 3 separate reviews for the 3 separate games, and instead judge this thing as a whole package and give it an overall verdict. I'll talk about the differences in each of the games, but only one verdict will be doled out. So let's jump face first into this.
Oh shit!
Spyro the Dragon was a series of platforming titles by Insomniac Games that focused more on world exploration and collection than Crash Bandicoot's start-to-finish platforming. Each game contains a different story and a different villain. The first game deals with Nasty Nork freezing dragons in Crystal because they didn't check their dragon privilege.
Besides, he is ugly. Ugly?
Except for Spyro because...
looks like I've got some things to do.
The second game deals with Spyro being essentially kidnapped and forced to do menial labor to gather shiny things in order to stop a non-threatening midget sorcerer.
No, Crush!
You may have been able to defeat that simpleton, but
Golf will be more than a match for you.
Bring it on, Shorty!
And the final one deals with the very adult fear of child kidnapping, as Spyro is once again forced to do a number of tasks just to get his family back.
We managed to capture the eggs, Your Highness. Every last one.
Excellent. Maybe you will amount to something after all.
Is it just me, or is everyone in Spyro's world except for Spyro and Sparks completely horrible? But the plots are just setups to have Spyro go on an adventure, and as that, they work, with a couple of cutscenes sprinkled with light humor to sweeten the deal. The first thing I want to comment is what's readily apparent once you start. This game is gorgeous. No, seriously, this game is amazing to look at. While the developers of Insane Trilogy didn't have a lot to work with, as their level design and loading method meant only a little bit of the level was visible at one time, allowing the PS1 to render more detail, Spyro had massive worlds and had to cut corners a bit on the presentation. And with those limitations no longer there, the game looks stellar. What was once flat textures and simple shapes now become twisted, cartoony landscapes. What was once a simple gathering of stone platforms and grassy areas now becomes a massive outdoor library. What were once blobby, polygonal things now look like these weird orc-like creatures. And considering the species' name is a cross between gnome and orc, it's highly appropriate. Grass moves and flows naturally, Spyro's flames look like actual flames, and Spyro no longer looks like he's getting stepped on when sliding or in whirlwinds. The whole game's like this, from the peaceful and serene stonework of the artisan's homeworld to the threatening but eerily calm midnight mountain homeworld. Each level essentially becomes a character in and among itself, each feeling distinct and unique, unlike Crash, which can use the same level variant several times in each game. Each level feels like a place where inhabitants would live, especially the first game where each level feels like an extension of the homeworld it comes from, outlining what the dragons in that world live like. The Beastmakers in particular impressed me with just how natural everything looks, even with the Norks industrializing everything around them. The game's charm also seeps in through its characters, more importantly their animations and voice acting. From the heroic and determined, yet delightfully playful Spyro, to calm, collected, yet often exasperated Elora, to Hunter, who plays the cool guy but is ultimately a big goof. I love each and every one of these characters. Except Moneybags, that bear I do not like.
Say, Spyro, you see this wall here? I bet you're dying to know what's on the other side. If only I... Okay, but as far as you know, the portal to Dragon Shores could be just on the other side of this wall. And there's only one way to find out. Ta-ta! Say, Spyro, you see this wall? Ah, yes. The sparkling beauty of those gems seems to have jogged my memory. Okay. So it's not the portal to Dragon Shores. Aquaria Towers is still a lovely place. Why, I have a home there myself.
Stop taking my gems, you walking paywall! One of the little touches I like is giving Sparks a personality, even if it's only for one cutscene. It's adorable seeing Sparks giving character instead of him simply being a gameplay mechanic.
Last one there's a Nork.
You shitting me?
The bad guys are also incredible. Nasty Nork with his intimidating, hulking presence looming over the entirety of the first game. Ripto, who acts like a big shot bad guy but is ultimately just an angry shrimp in a cape. The only villain that came off lacking to me was the Sorceress, because, first of all, she's simply called Sorceress. What kind of name is that? Ladies and gentlemen, they call him Barkeep. And second, because she's simply not in the game all that much. Yeah, she had cutscenes, but those were clearly focused on Bianca and her development to an eventual turnaround. Ultimately, the Sorceress seems like an afterthought in a game where the plot is simply an excuse to go on an adventure. Each game is pretty much set up the same. There are a set number of homeworlds with a number of levels within accessed via portal doors. You enter each level, collect a large amount of the game's MacGuffin and as many gems as you can, and you move on to the next one. In the first game, the major MacGuffin was dragons, and the dragons are the very reason Spyro 1 ends up my favorite of the entire Reignited Trilogy. Each Elder Dragon is unique in both design and personality. This makes saving each one individually worth it. When I saved a dragon, I wasn't doing it to make an arbitrary number go up. I was doing it to see what the next one would say, what he would look like, and what information he'd give to Spyro. Each dragon had their own story to tell, whether it was with their mouths or with their design. Imagine my surprise when a freaking rattlesnake dragon appeared, or the baker dragon, or the poet-scholar dragon, or the actor dragon, or the hammer-wielding dragon, or a commando dragon. I haven't even scratched the surface! There are also gems and dragon eggs stolen by thieves, which are also required for progression, but the dragons are your primary concern. The second game has you collecting two separate MacGuffin: talismans, which are the reward for completing a level, and orbs, which are your rewards for side quests. The game makes you collect all of the talismans to access the first two boss fights, but also makes you gather a required number of orbs in order to access the final boss? So what was the point of the talismans? To make sure we completed every world? The levels in the Winter Tundra homeworld have no talismans whatsoever, so why bother? Progression works in a similar way to Spyro 3, only this time there's only one MacGuffin, dragon eggs, which need to be collected in order to activate some of the levels. But you still need to finish the level because an inhabitant from each level will come back with you and help you build some sort of contraption needed to travel to the next area and fight the homeworld's boss. And just like Spyro 2, you have to collect a certain amount of dragon eggs in order to access the final boss anyway, so making us complete the levels is kinda pointless. In Spyro 1, the dragons and gems are simply lying out in the level to be collected, and it's up to the player to find them. With the exception of the dragon eggs, which are being hoarded by these little blue bastards who taunt you with the most annoying sound in the world and need to be chased down in order to collect the egg. Get back here, you stupid fuck! In Spyro 2, there are no MacGuffins out in the wild, and a task must be completed in order to collect the talismans and orbs. While the talismans are easy enough, just get to the end of the level, orbs require you to pass some sort of challenge, and these challenges range from fun to boring to frustrating to— Oh my god, get back here, you f***ing kangaroo motherfucker! I will rip off your dead tail and shove it down your throat if you do not stop! Spyro 3 mixes the two, so while some eggs are hidden behind tasks, others are just put out in the open, or can be completed by reaching a certain area in a level. And unlike in the other two games where boss fights were simply progression, the boss fights in 3 actually give you a dragon egg each. Speaking of the boss fights, there are a number of those within these games, and in the second and third games they're required to progress to the next homeworld. In the first game, however, they're essentially another level within the hubs, and they can be skipped altogether if you have the required amount of whatever you need to access the next hub world. The only world where beating them, aka reaching the end, is required to progress is the final world, aka Nasty's World, or Nork Nexus, whichever one you prefer, in which each world opens up after the next until you fight the final boss. The only boss required to fight within the first game. I kinda prefer this method of level progression, as you can skip any of the levels that seem either hard or boring and come back later for 100%. I'm looking at you, Treetops. Especially since the boss fights in this one are kinda pathetic. Each boss has the same pattern. The boss waits for you in an area and attacks you when you get in range. You attack it and it runs to a new area. You give chase, repeat until done. Strictly speaking, the boss fights are just like regular levels with one strong enemy waiting for you somewhere down the line. Later games bosses have more complex strategies and fight you in an arena, which makes it feel more like an actual boss fight, with the most notable bosses being the Spyro 2 ones since you see all of them in the opening cutscene. Spyro 1's bosses don't even get cutscenes, and Spyro 3's bosses are all just creatures that the game developers pulled out of their hat. Gameplay-wise, Spyro the Dragon is no slouch. Spyro has a basic moveset which revolves around his abilities as a dragon. Pressing the flame button will have Spyro breathe a mid-range burst of flame to attack enemies with. Perfect for bringing down most enemies. Holding the charge button will cause Spyro to break into a steady charge that's not only a good method to attack enemies, but also a good way to run faster and save on travel time. There are certain enemies and chests that can only be defeated a certain way. Big enemies can't be charged because Spyro is too small to do any damage with his horns, and must be flamed in order to defeat them, whilst some enemies with metal armor or shields are flame-proof and must be charged to take them out. Some enemies are big and wear armor, so a more advanced tactic must be used, such as flaming a vulnerable area or pushing them off a cliff. Spyro also has the ability to glide through the air using his wings, which is a finicky thing in Spyro 1. In Spyro 2 and 3, Spyro gets the ability to hover after a glide, giving him a tiny bit of lift at the end of his glide. This is useful if you misjudge a glide, need to reach farther, or reposition yourself before landing. This ability does not exist in Spyro 1, so you have to judge the distance of your glide perfectly before gliding, and I think most of my deaths in Spyro are due to misjudging a glide and falling to my doom. I don't know, I think a ledge grab would have been useful in this situation. But then again, I'm not a game developer, what do I know? Spyro feels easy to control, although charging feels unwieldy and jumping feels sort of floaty, but I believe that these were both intentional, and they're not big complaints, they're just there. Spyro 2 and 3 introduced 3 very situational new moves for Spyro to perform, which includes swimming, climbing ladders, and head bashing. And aside from swimming, I can count the number of times I remember using climbing and head bashing on one hand. This isn't a Crash 2 and 3 situation where new moves make the game completely different. You won't be cursing the lack of head bash move in Spyro 1, that's for sure. Speaking of the controls though, there are the flight stages. In these stages, Spyro is free to fly around at his leisure, but must collect or torch a certain number of objects in a certain time frame, and completing these stages is needed for 100%, though not needed for progression. Spyro automatically flies forward, and you must steer him through arches, hoops, and use his flame to torch certain objects. In the end, you're awarded with gems for each goal you complete, with an all-in-one bonus being awarded for doing everything in the stage. Spyro controls well enough, but certain stages have speed-ups which cause Spyro's steering to become slippery, which I didn't think was possible in air, but I adjusted just fine. It's gonna catch newcomers off guard though, so be careful for that. In later games, these stages also house MacGuffins, but unless you're going for 100% completion, all of these stages can be flat out ignored. And Spyro's not the only one to be controlled here. In Spyro 3, you can freely play as some other characters. Sheila the Kangaroo, Sergeant Bird the Penguin, Bentley the Yeti, and Agent 9 the Crazy Fly-Me Monkey. Sheila has mad hops and is generally used for more vertical-styled platforming. Sergeant Bird can awkwardly fly and are used in parts that require free flight. Bentley is a big yet eloquent brute who is a force to be reckoned with, and his forte is smashing things with his club. And Agent 9 is Ratchet and Clank. Or Doom. Or a rail shooter. Look, his gameplay changes every time you play him, he's really confusing. You won't play as them much, but you'll also be driving a lot of vehicles, each of which comes with its own set of controls. Like a skateboard, a submarine, a hover tank, a jet boat, there's a lot here. Spyro 3 is very gimmick heavy, and I can see where that could be a turnoff. One last thing I would like to mention here are the glitches. Spyro Reignited has its fair share of them, and while one got away with almost none and two had one here or there, such as this glitch, which has Spyro doing his best Tasmanian devil impersonation, Spyro 3 had them in almost every other level. Now, according to what I've heard, it's because Toys for Bob didn't actually work on 3, and it was a company called Sanzaru Games, who did the 3DS Sonic Boom games and the Sly Cooper Thieves in Time game. Whatever happened, there was more glitches than I care to count. Hopefully these can be fixed in a patch, but none of them were game-breaking, so don't expect any lost saves here or there. Spyro Reignited Trilogy set out to bring 3 classic games from the PS1 era back to modern gaming, with a fresh HD look, and they succeeded. I enjoyed my time with Spyro Reignited. From gorgeous visuals to smooth gameplay, Spyro is definitely back.